I don't. This is
Okay.
in the Memphis area, so local folks probably remember this story. We want to welcome Stephen Owens, who's a teacher in Nashville. He and his family live in the Nashville area. He's the author of Set Free, Discover Forgiveness Amidst Murder and Betrayal. Stephen Owens wrote this with Ken Abraham, who's a New York Times best-selling author. And Stephen, we want to welcome you to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Hi, Stephen.
Hey, how are you?
We're doing really, really well and just blown away by your story.
Yes, you were, and just to kind of get folks up to speed, if they've never heard of this story, you were 12 years old when your mother, Gail Owens, hired a hitman to murder your father. And when I started reading your book, I thought, this sounds like an episode of, CSI or Law and Order. But this was a real event, and it turned your life, obviously, upside down. Why don't you kind of lay out a little bit about this story? Because this story, we do want to let people know, this story, in some ways, obviously in some ways is a tragedy, but in some ways it is a story of redemption and forgiveness. So we want to let people know that God is glorified by the things that he did for you, but lay out the other side, the tragic side of what happened when you were 12 years old.
Well, we lived in Memphis, and we were, what I would consider, and most probably from the outside would be just your wholesome Christian family. Grew up in church. In February of 1985, I walked in on a Sunday night into my home to find my father laying in the floor of our home in the den. I went in and found that he had been beaten to death by a man who was waiting on him when he came home that night. Within a week of that, I found out that my mom had hired the man to carry out the murder, and they arrested her and tried her a year later, almost to the day, and she received the death penalty in the state of Tennessee. She would have been the first female executed in the state of Tennessee at this time in 180 years. As you can imagine, there was a lot of anger and resentment that built into me and that I dealt with for many, many years. And obviously just the tragedy of dealing with losing both of my parents within a course of a week or so.
Did you have other siblings?
Yes, I have a younger brother. He's about 3.5 years younger than me.
Did you, see this coming at all? You were young, but did this just shock you? Did your parents fight? Were they having problems? Was there a lot of anger in the home and, just fighting and going back and forth? So this just totally caught you off guard.
It really caught me off guard. Like I said, if anybody would have stopped and asked me about the kind of family that we had, I would have told you that we were just a normal family who loved each other, went to church, believed in our Christian values, and lived what I guess you could call a normal life. So, no, the issues that were going on in our family, I had no clue.
We're talking to Stephen Owens, who's the author of a book called Set Free, Discover Forgiveness Amidst Murder and Betrayal. When Stephen was 12 years old, he walked in and found his father beaten badly. He soon died, I think later that night, and discovered when his mom was arrested less than a week later that she had hired a hitman to murder Stephen's father. Now, one of the things that I found interesting about the story, and Christianity can be a cover. And especially in the South, you grew up in Memphis, the Bible Belt. Everybody's a Christian, and we all go to church, so on and so forth.
And everybody has a happy Leave It to Beaver family.
Yes, a Leave It to Beaver family. Mm-hmm. Everything's going fine. But the reality is, as this process progressed and as things came out through the legal process, and later on in life, I'm sure you discovered details that demonstrated that under the facade, the life that your mother and father were living was not tied up in a nice, neat Christian bow, was it?
No, it wasn't. There were some evidence of affairs, obviously, that I had no clue. As a 12-year-old boy, as I was, my dad was kind of put on a pedestal. He played in athletics. I did athletics, was very interested, spent a lot of time with him doing things that you would normally do with your father. So, when it first happened, not knowing everything at the time, it was hard to deal with because, I looked at him as being the one that was perfect in a lot of ways, and then I looked at, obviously, my mother as being the one that did something that I could never imagine. As I did go through and years later and obviously realized that there were some affairs and other problems in the marriage, then all of a sudden, one of the hardest things for me was realizing that my dad wasn't that perfect man that I really thought he was. Mm-hmm. So it was a struggle on both sides, both with that realization and dealing with, obviously, the stuff with my mother.
I think we all struggle with that as well, that our parents, none of them had perfect marriages, even though we like to believe that they did. They were people like us. And I think you're right. We all put them on pedestals that, they do everything just right and everything is wrapped up in a nice, pretty bow. But this went further because, she had your father killed. And can you kind of walk us through, you had to obviously go live with other people, and then ultimately your mom received a death sentence, but then was released, which shocked me. Can you kind of, tell us about this journey? I know that's a lot to ask at one time, but, we could keep you for hours, but only have you this short amount of time, and we just want you to walk us through this journey. It's really tremendous.
Yes, I moved in with my aunt. She raised my brother and I, and my mother obviously was in prison. And for 23 years, I was, as I have said, was full of a lot of anger and resentment. Matter of fact, had no communication with my mother at all.
You didn't go see her in jail?
Didn't go see her or nothing. Didn't want to talk to her. Didn't want to have anything to do with her. I got married in 1997, and my wife and I moved to Nashville in 2000. We moved to Nashville in 2000 for many reasons. One was just a fresh start. When you have lived your whole life in one city and then you have such an event happen, whether the pressure is legitimate or not, I just felt a lot of pressure living in Memphis. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So my wife and I decided to move to Nashville. I did realize at the time I was moving closer to where Mom was. Mom was in a prison here in Nashville. But I didn't think about it much because that was just, as far as I was concerned, was a moot point. I was trying to do what was best for me and a fresh start. Little did I know that was probably the first step in a plan that God had for my life that, I can be honest, tell you, I never knew I would end up where I am today. It really started with God just putting a lot of different things, people and things in my life, and I'll share some of those with you. The first thing was my first son was born in Halloween of 2001, though my mother and I had not spoken to each other in years, I felt like just the right thing to do was to let her know that she was a grandmother. So my first correspondence with my mother in over 20 years was a Christmas card in December of 2001, basically just letting her know that she was a grandmother, and I sent a picture. Then when I moved to Nashville, I taught in Memphis. When I moved to Nashville, I could not find a teaching job. And I worked for about 3.5 years after moving to Nashville in 2000, doing another job, which I was not was not what I wanted to do. It's not what I thought God had called me to do. Because of my situation, I'd always felt like God had called me to a place to help young men and young women, and my venue was in the classroom of a school. And so I couldn't find a job. And then about 3.5 years later, I get a call from my father-in-law that says, I have a teaching job if you want it, but it's in a prison. And so I took a job, believe it or not, teaching inmates in a prison. for a year here in Nashville. And I think that was God's guidance, because one of the things I learned there was the people inside the walls of prisons are really no different than you and I, except for their mistakes carry a greater penalty than ours that we make every day we walk this earth.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
And that was one of the biggest, that was one of the major things that God really showed me in that. I left there and went to a private school north of Nashville and spent a year there. And at the end of that year, because of the distance from my home, the headmaster offered to call another headmaster of a private school in Nashville and see if they had an opening that for me closer to my home. That headmaster that she called was the headmaster of a school here in Nashville called Christ Presbyterian Academy. And that is a school that I had applied to some years earlier when I couldn't find a job and they didn't have an opening. But he had an opening for a science teacher, which I teach, and a basketball coach, which I also do, and they had not even advertised it. So I felt like, again, God was just really guiding my steps in that.
Mm-hmm.
I later was giving my testimony to a freshman class my first year at Christ Pres, and there is a coworker who comes up to me and then tells me after I give my testimony that my mother has been attending his Bible studies in his prison ministry for over 8 or 9 years.
What are the chances
Wow.
of that?
Absolutely. So he became, I think God puts people in our lives, to be honest, that kind of prod us in this journey. And he became one of those people, constantly asking me if I'd ever thought about seeing Mom. Do you want to go? And for many, for several years, I said no. But in all that, God really started to make me want to seek what he teaches us on forgiveness. And so I really dove into a lot of scriptures in Matthew and some different books of the Bible. And what I found and what God taught me was, we want to forgive the things that are easy to forgive and hold on to the ones that we think we deserve to hold on to. But that's not what God tells us to do. And so as I was really diving into that, I just know the anger and resentment just went away. It just really started to dissipate. And then in 2008, I was out actually exercising, and I was on a run that afternoon, and I was on my way in from the run. I was about 1.5 miles from the house, and I was listening to iPod, and My Redeemer the song came on. And here's what I know. I remember when the song came on, and I remember where I was, and the next thing I knew, I was standing in the driveway of my home, and I don't remember the run from the time that came on, and God just really, really spoke to me, and all he said to me was, Stephen, I have you now where you need to be, and basically you know what you need to do. So in August of 2008, I decided that I would go see my mom for the first time in over 23 years to tell her what God had brought me to a place to tell her face-to-face that she had been forgiven. So as we all do, I think as Christians, sometimes we know what we're supposed to do, but it takes us a while to do it. And finally, in August of 2009, August 22nd of 2009, I walked in and saw my mom for the first time in 24 years. And we met for 3.5 hours, and it was only the last 5 minutes of our visit that God really opened the door that I knew was the opportunity, and I told my mom that I had forgiven her, and that's why God had me there after so many years.
Well, in this book, and we're talking again to Stephen Owens, who has written the book, Set Free, Discover Forgiveness Amidst Murder and Betrayal.